This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I am sitting in Long Beach, California right now for this week's episode, and across from me is Julian Shrago, co-owner and brewmaster for Beachwood Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Julian.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. It's an honor to be here, and I am a big fan of your publication.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Let's double down on that fandom.
It's a mutual admiration society right here.
Love it.
We're gonna talk about IPA brewing because we're here on the West Coast, and West Coast IPA is definitely not dead. We're also going to talk about coffee beers. We're going to talk about brewing stouts because that's another thing that you all love to do, even though we are here where it's warm. We're not going to talk about brewing wild and sour and funky beers. There's another episode of that, episode 103 of the podcast, where we dove in with Harrison McCabe from the Beachwood Blendery side and talked about how you all have made, and those beers have been so pivotal, interesting, and award-winning, especially with our blind judges, past beers of the year for craft beer and brewing. And so, but this episode, we're going to talk about IPAs, stouts, and this, I hate even calling it the clean side of beer because
that's okay. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I'm a heavy metal guy, and when you hit those clean notes and clean chords, boom.
I'm a prog metal guy, and so when you have those clean and shimmering notes, and then you dive into that deep crunch, it's the dynamics that just rip your guts out. And so,
sure.
So we'll explore those dynamics here in the episode, and maybe we'll share some tips for shredding on metal guitar too. We'll see. Anyway, Beachwood has won 18 GABF medals, 9 World Beer Cup medals. Pretty impressive for, given that this is 10, 11 years old now.
10 years old now. And thank you for noting that. Yeah, it's been a really humbling trip for sure.
Well, we're going to try to dive into what makes it so good. Before we do that, like your flagship beer, you can rely on G&D chillers for the same quality and consistency. G&D guarantees that every chiller they build will hit 28 degrees without breaking a sweat. They never stop. They draft, they craft, they service each and every brewery, big or small, all in an effort to build one hell of a chiller. For nearly 30 years, G&D has been committed to cold. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by Raw North Star Pils, a new base malt to set your compass by. Raw North Star Pils is crafted for brewers looking for a domestic Pilsner malt with low color and low modification. North Star Pils carries overtones of honey and sweetbread supported by flavors and aromas of hay and a nutty character. It's suitable for any beer style, but particularly craft brewed versions of classic lagers. Let Raw North Star Pils guide your craft by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. So Julian, we normally start off the podcast talking a little bit about you. Give me your background. What's your arc through brewing? First passionate as a home brewer and beer fanatic, and then moving into the professional sphere.
Yeah. So before I was a professional brewer, I was an aerospace engineer, and my interest in home brewing was actually kicked off my freshman year in college in the mid-90s. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area surrounded by craft beer. My parents were drinking Anchor, Steam, and Sierra Nevada Pale Ale when those were quote unquote micro brews.
Sure.
Those micro brews. And so that was something I was exposed to from a very early age. And when I went to school in Santa Barbara, there was a lot of craft beer available in my area. Firestone had just opened, and Double Barrel Ale was the only thing that they were producing in 22-ounce bombers. And I heard a couple friends, classmates talking about homebrewing, and it piqued my interest. I went home for the winter break my freshman year and mentioned homebrewing to my parents, and they said, hey, the Oak Barrel Winecraft, shout out, in Berkeley, I think that's a homebrew store. Let's get you a holiday gift there, and maybe I think they sell homebrewing kits. So they took me there, and Homer, good old Homer, everybody knows him, hooked me up with my first homebrew kit, and that was in the mid-90s, and I brewed a wheat beer. It turned out clean. I was immediately hooked, And it was something that I did off and on for a number of years as a casual hobby, all the while being very enthusiastic and curious about all craft beer and constantly trying things around me. And in 2003, I got laid off from my engineering job in the Silicon Valley and came to Southern California because that was the first work that I could find working for an aerospace company in LA. Being lonely, single, and kind of bored, I dove a little bit deeper into home brewing, and I went to Steinfiller's in Long Beach and got back into home brewing, and then it very quickly became a deep passion of mine. Right around that same time, Russian River Brewing opened its brew pub in downtown Santa Rosa. Jeff Bagby had just kind of taken a seat at Pizza Port Carlsbad. Tommy Arthur was still brewing at Pizza Port Solana Beach. So I had access to all these guys that were fairly available. And they put up with my incessant homebrew tasting and me bringing stuff to them. And it was one of these things that kind of just grew organically. And I always thought that I would keep it as a very passionate hobby because I was happy being an engineer and I was happy with the living that it afforded me.
You live in California. It's expensive to live here. Having an aerospace engineering salary is a little bit better than a shift brewer salary.
Probably. But in the kind of mid-2000s, I'd become discontent with my job. And I thought, maybe I can open up a brewery. And so I put together a business plan to open a small production brewery. Right around that same time, my friends Gabe and Lena, who are married, they had Beachwood Barbecue in Seal Beach. They were getting ready to expand their restaurant enterprise. And they wanted to add a unique component to it, but a lot of kind of curated craft beer bars were opening up at that time. Right. So they thought, well, what if we can actually just build out a brewery, a brew pub, and we know Julian wants to open up a brewery. Let's partner with him. And so thus Beachwood Barbecue and Brewing was born. I was more than enthusiastic to join their team and partner up with them. And that was my first and really only foray into professional brewing is Beachwood Barbecue and Brewing and Beachwood Brewing. It's fairly singular in that respect. So this is it. This is only the only brewing job I've ever had.
That's a simple and straightforward story.
That's my answer.
Yeah. So for those out there who are, there's always that dynamic, and a lot of brewers will say, go work at a brewery before you try to start a brewery. But, the time frame that you were doing that, it wasn't as easy to go do that. It wasn't like, I can just go do an apprenticeship or work for 6 months and learn the ropes here before I do my own thing.
It wasn't, but one of the things that I have to credit a lot of people like Tommy Arthur, Jeff Bagby, everybody else at Pizza Port, Roger Davis at now at Faction, at the time Triple Rock, and then Jonathan Porter when he was just starting Smog City out of Tustin Brewing Company. Over 10 years ago. Those are people that gave me opportunities to collaborate with them and take a lot of my homebrewed recipes and brew them on a commercial scale. It was really a unique opportunity, and I owe them a debt of gratitude for that. So I did get exposure to professional brewing before I jumped in, and I'm really thankful for that. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them.
Well, it didn't take you long to hit the ground running and start winning medals. I mean, they started coming in 2012, 2013, when the brewery was only a couple of years old. I want to dive in and see what, how that magic started to happen and what it took to kind of, especially as you got things off the ground, build an identity for Beachwood and kind of design a beer focus for this, because it's a brew pub also, in addition to now a packaging brewery. You have a very diverse approach to styles. You brew a lot of different beers, and yet at the same time, there's been some real focus on some very specific things that you have decided to just narrow in on and work and learn and continue to develop. And so I want to ask you and talk to you about some of those things you've learned. Before we do that, the world of craft beer is a different place now. Margins are more important than ever, so why not lower your ingredient cost? Craft juice concentrates from Old Orchard are a cost-effective solution for your fruit-forward needs. Old Orchard produces high volumes of their retail juice brand, so economies of scale keep prices low for their bulk supply program. A little concentrate goes a long way, and you won't lose some of it through filtering like you would with purees. To start increasing your margins now, head on over to www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, what if you could take your favorite recipe and make a non-alcoholic version without sacrificing the flavor, color, or beer quality? NA no problem. The Alchemator from ProBrew uses proprietary membrane technology to strip the alcohol from the beer without sacrificing all the elements like flavor and color that make beer great. Are you ready to brew like a pro? The Alchemator from ProBrew. NA no problem. Email contact@probrew.com for more information. So you guys are deciding to start up Beachwood Brewing. How did you decide on what kind of beer program to build? Clearly, you're on the West Coast. IPA was going to be, some sort of big piece of that, even in the late, 20-aughts and early 20-teens.
Right.
IPA was already the thing that you had to make. But that's not all you make. You have a very diverse approach to beer here. And again, driven by that kind of brew pub beer that people are going to drink with food kind of approach. Talk to me about how you started formulating what those beers were going to be and why.
I've always been a curious person that also, as my scientific sensibilities will drive me to interminable revision, believing that things can always be made a little bit better and to never just think that you've arrived in some kind of final destination. Like that's the beer. It will never change. It can never get better. So when we opened the pub, I knew that I wanted to brew a wide range of beers, but I didn't know quite how wide. And I was fairly convinced that, like many brew pubs that came before us, we would have a certain amount of flagships and like, these are the beers that we're going to brew and these are the beers that people are going to drink. And occasionally we'll throw in a twist and do some kind of one-off beer. And when we first opened, our beers were Knucklehead Red, Uno, which is a Belgian single ale, Kilgore Stout, the American Stout. Let me see, what else did we have? We had a beer called Punk Wheat, which was hoppy American wheat ale. We've never rebrewed since that first batch. A beer that became Breaker Pale Ale, which was kind of a Sierra Nevada inspired Cascade Columbus Pale Ale. And then lastly, Melrose, our original flagship IPA, the original Beachwood IPA, and that was a homebrew that I moved over to a production setting. In fact, a lot of those beers that I just mentioned were homebrews. Started out as homebrews, got refined as homebrews, and then got migrated to the Beachwood domain. And I thought, you know what, those are the 6 beers that I'm always going to brew. Those are going to be on year round. And the public had a very different opinion about that.
Sure.
So that kind of changed what we were doing early on. Another thing that changed what we were doing early on is hop contracting was something that was fairly easy to do for many, many years, even arguably decades. And when we opened in 2011, that was kind of on the heels of that hop crisis of 2008, 2009.
Right.
When everybody was over-contracted, that was when I believe Anheuser-Busch decided to abandon Willamette hops, and then suddenly there was this glut of this huge crop that was no longer needed. So hop contracts really got very quickly adjusted tightly. And when we opened, kind of the reaction that I got from our suppliers is, oh, you're a new brewery? Yeah, we're not going to contract with you, or we're going to give you a very restricted contract because we don't know who you are, and you essentially have no business credit. So I had to buy surplus hops from friends at other breweries the first year that we were open, and I think I got my first Amarillo and Simcoe, the 2 driving hops in Melrose. I bought those from Russian River Brewing, and Vinny graciously sold those to me. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we have enough to maybe brew Melrose every 2-3 months. So that whole idea of us having this beer year round, it's out the window. And I had a couple other IPAs in my repertoire. So we started, I can get Simcoe and Chinook. We can brew Thrill Seeker. Somebody just gave me a box of Citra. Okay, I've got Amarillo and Citra. We can brew a new IPA called Hop Jitsu. And almost right away, we were brewing all these one-off beers, and then it became a thing that we did.
Just driven because of ingredient availability, and then that started driving product strategy.
Yes. So originally it was out of necessity, and then the customer was stoked because, I came into Beachwood last week and you guys had different beers on. There's something new. I'm going to keep coming in. So it was almost by accidents and just circumstance that happened. But we saw really early on the value of having a wide variety of house beers.
And it kind of speaks to that, even at that time period, that kind of nascent and budding exploratory approach to drinking beer that hadn't quite gathered full steam. That was still a little bit pre-Untapped, but there was still that kind of beer advocate or rate beer driven. I want to try, different beers, and that scratches that itch.
It totally does. And variety is the spice of life. Not just for consumers, but also for brewers too. When you get to do something new and different all the time, and you get to exercise that kind of creative autonomy, it is the ultimate fuel for your fire. And that, I think, is one of the things that has always driven Beachwood. It is an integral part of our business fabric, having creative autonomy and being able to do whatever we want, whenever we want. Case in point, the double IPA that we drank earlier today called Dank Brigade. I hadn't tried that until you and I drank it. So that was my lead brewer, Gene, formulated that recipe here. And he knew we needed some kind of hop-driven beer, whether it was a West Coast IPA or a West Coast double IPA. It's his choice, his creative freedom, and he came up with that magnificent beer.
Let's talk a little bit about how you develop a Beachwood character to these beers. Clearly, the recipes and the ideas came out of your own home brewing, but there's a character to the way that you brew that becomes kind of evocative of a Beachwood approach to brewing. How, as you continued to develop on a kind of professional scale, how did you start thinking about building that kind of commonality or continuity through those beers, and so that there was something that felt familiar, even though you're using different ingredients and different beers and expressing different kinds of things?
Whenever I formulate a recipe, I think of flavor first. What do I want this beer to taste like? From there, I'm able to back in things like what aroma is going to complement those flavors, what mouthfeel is going to carry those flavors, what level of carbonation is going to work with this flavor profile. But flavor first is what I come up with. And as a home brewer, I was able to brew any style that I wanted whenever I want. I was able to experiment with all sorts of different malts. I didn't have to just use one type of base malt. I didn't just have to use one type of roast barley. I could try the same beer with 3 or 4 different roast barleys. And so after a while, you kind of develop these predictive sensibilities where you formulate a recipe on paper and you look at it and you say, I know what that's going to taste like. And when you start getting less and less surprised by what the final beer tastes like, that's good. Then you've developed that correlation and you're like, I have this idea for a beer. I know what it's going to taste like. And you hit that target. So that was one thing that was really important as a home brewer, but as just a brewer in general, thinking of flavor first, that is the kernel for every Beachwood beer.
Now, ingredients also change and shift over time. And so, that kind of move, especially over the last 10 years, hops have gone through their own significant changes. There's certainly crop year changes, but in addition to that, reduced kilning temperatures, all these other kinds of elements that also impact those flavors continuously kind of change those expectations for you. As a matter of ongoing process, how do you incorporate and the understanding of those shifts as they start happening?
Well, one, to never take for granted that your ingredients are just going to perform the same all the time. Expecting those changes is important, and committing to memory your ideal of what those ingredients should taste like together or on their own, or kind of envisioning a new target. Like, hey, I loved this flagship IPA for years, but that one key hop is kind of going in a different direction. I like it. I don't like it. How do I want to change this direction of the beer? But you have to really kind of sharpen your palate and your senses and commit a lot of that to memory. And I think, at least for me, one way that I work with natural ingredients is trying to look for consistency and inconsistency at the same time. Mosaic is one of those hops that, for me, for years has had some kind of common threads, no matter where it's grown, when it's harvested. Some crops are much better than others, but to me, Mosaic almost always has a common thread. Of blueberry almost has a common kind of dirty gym sock component to it. The in-between is not always the same, and the in-between is what we seek out most of the time, kind of those subtle in-between differences. And there are other ingredients, other hop varieties that I think have diverged from what my memory of them was. And sometimes we embrace those changes and just accept that's how things have gone. And other times we say, you know what, that's not what I remember it to be, and I think I'm going to leave that in the past.
Sure. Let's talk about IPA recipe over time. Now, clearly, with Jeff Bagby and Tommy Arthur and others, there's this solid LA, San Diego, Orange County kind of connection of and continuity of West Coast IPA. It's very pale. It's pretty dry. There's a kind of punchiness to it. But at the same time, as I taste your IPAs like Amalgamator now, none of these taste like IPA tasted 10 years ago. That, there is a common thread through them, but they have also developed over that time and shifted in order to adjust to where palates have continued to move today, but also to take advantage of the kind of intensity and flavor forward hops that are now available to people that just weren't available 10 years ago. Talk to me about some of that kind of evolutionary process of West Coast IPA for you.
Well, thank you for saying that, and thank you for noticing the evolution of flavor. Certainly, even our flagship IPAs like Amalgamator and Citraholic have changed from where they originally started. As my palate has developed, and as styles develop, my preferences have changed. And for me, West Coast IPA is still definitively dry. It should always be a dry beer, much like a Saison. It should always be a dry beer. That's a governing characteristic for me. Having intense aroma is also another governing characteristic. Where the bitterness lies and where the hop flavor lies, that's something that I think has shifted around a little bit. And so Amalgamator is a beer that is very focused on hop aroma and hop flavor, and less focused on hop bitterness than it was years ago when we first started brewing it, right. Roughly 2012 timeframe.
That time frame, like Stone becomes one of those kind of overarching defining IPA things with this ragged, intense, rough, just in your face bitterness. And I mean, for a lot of craft beer, we've seen that happen. Craft beer, it's almost like a kid who gets into a subculture and has to prove that they're the most subculture of that subculture by, it was that the new metal kid that wore the baggiest pants,
right.
It was, the juggalo that had the best face paint, there's that, like, you have to prove it by going way overboard. And craft beer had to prove that it was something different by casting itself against this idea of mainstream beer. And it did it by being way bitter, offensively bitter, or in a high ABV, and this beer isn't for everybody. And thankfully, over the last decade, we've been able to find a more comfortable place, grow comfortable in the idea of craft beer being more nuanced and subtle, and being able to explore smaller pieces, of these things. And that's a much more mature place for craft beer to be. But at the same time, like, that requires approaching ideas of building bitterness in a completely different way. And, and like massaging and structuring these beers in a drastically different approach.
It does. And there is something to be said for intensity. And I believe that West Coast IPA should have intense aroma and intense flavor. They don't necessarily need to have intense bitterness. Firm bitterness is important. But I think years ago, a lot of craft beers distinguished themselves from macros, which were regarded as these kind of watery, insipid things that you drink because you just want refreshment. You don't really care what you're drinking. craft beer distinguished itself by having these really intense styles. And I think people realize that you don't need to have this, up against the wall intensity. You can dial that back a little bit and let some nuance bloom forward. And so that's kind of where I think West Coast IPAs landed. And I think West Coast IPA has actually also been influenced recently by New England IPA. So New England IPA in general is...
It's a bold statement, my friend.
Well, I say that with all boldness because New England IPAs are intensely aromatic,
sure,
very fruity, but in general are regarded as having very soft bitterness. And I think there were a lot of brewers, especially on the West Coast, that initially rejected those beers, but after trying them several times, whether they realized it or not, I think started to tune into the fact that there's this idea of really incredibly intense aroma with soft bitterness. Maybe I can borrow some of those components and bring it over to a West Coast beer and still have it be, intrinsically West Coast and unambiguously West Coast. But bump up the aroma, bump up the flavor, and still have a moderate bitterness, but it doesn't need to be a crushing bitterness. And so I think that has had an influence on West Coast beer and has to on Beachwood's beer as well.
It's interesting. I tend to look at it as a dialogue, that I think that these beers, are, and these styles converse with each other. And that some of the techniques that are now used in New England style IPAs, were starting to be developed by West Coast IPA brewers in terms of extreme late hopping, of putting all the hops in the whirlpool and then pushing a large load of that, and even bittering contributions into dry hopping, where they can still add bitterness even if it's not necessarily measurable. Those are things that West Coast IPA brewers were working on, and then kind of were thrown into hyper speed by New England IPA brewers. And then and so it's just been this constant dialogue and forming back and forth between those things. But the beers that we have now on both sides, I think, are better for that dialogue. I
agree. I will also say that there's a distinctive regional difference in how brewers approach things, and there are distinctively different regional tastes and aroma profiles. And I think to really understand West Coast IPA, you need to kind of drink fresh pub beer that's brewed in San Diego. That is what, whenever I think of West Coast IPA, I think of going and getting a beer fresh on tap at Pizza Port. I mean, that's
sure,
my go-to right there. That's it.
And that experience of West Coast IPA, and I love what you say about that. There is a dramatic regional difference in these things. That same West Coast style IPA that I might drink at La Cumbre in Albuquerque has a very, and from others like Boxing Bear and Bosque and whatnot in Albuquerque, there's a regional difference to their approach to West Coast IPA. It's complementary, but it's different. Just like when you go to Portland, Oregon, or Seattle, Washington, and taste that Pacific Northwest approach to West Coast IPA, it's very regionalized, and they love dank up there in the Pacific Northwest.
Sure.
More so than even San Diego. And, those are beautiful, differing regional kind of expressions of this broader idea of West Coast IPA.
Right.
And I can't call it terroir because it's more local, cultural differences that drive interest in different kinds of flavors. But it's fascinating that those kinds of things exist.
Right. And even when you go to another area that claims to be, oh, dude, try my West Coast IPA, and you have it and this is a great beer, but this isn't what I have at home.
Sure.
And it's almost like, I'm sure this is how international brewers feel when they come to the United States, or when anybody travels to another region and like a German brewer, for example, comes to the United States and some brewery here says, "Oh, try my Kolsch," and the German brewer is like, "Yeah, that's nice. That's a nice blonde ale. I'm not sure that's a Kolsch." And so when you're constantly exposed to things in your local region, you develop very acute senses of what something is. Whether or not it should be that, you develop acute senses of what something is. So if you live in San Diego and you drink something like Pizza Port IPA all the time, you know what a Pizza Port IPA is.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about some of the kind of ingredient choices and the way that you select hops and kind of building some of these fundamentals of your IPAs. Before we do that, your beer deserves all your attention. Clarion makes that a little easier. Their food-grade lubricants will help keep your system running smooth while also safeguarding your product from costly contamination and recall, because then you'll be in full compliance with food safety standards, and it's all thanks to a simple switch to Clarion, a food-safe system that lets you focus on your craft. We'll drink to that. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. So talk to me about how, in this kind of San Diego, LA, Long Beach, kind of continuity of West Coast IPA, you build an idea of malt and hops to reflect the kind of crisp, dry, and expressive approach, to hops.
A lot of this kind of harkens back to two really important beers that I had in the early 2000s. I have very vivid memories of both of those beers and also talking to the brewers about them. Not so coincidentally, one was brewed by Jeff Bagby called Poor Man's IPA, which is a double IPA. And I remember the first batch of beer that I had, and the aroma and the dryness and the subdued malt character blew my socks off. And then another one that I had was called Lupulin, which is a play on lupulin, obviously. Sure. And I had that at Pizza Port in Solana Beach. And this is when Tommy was still brewing all the beers there. This probably was around 2005 or 2006. And I didn't know what the beer was, but I saw it on the menu and I knew that's going to be hoppy. So I ordered it, and the aroma just I fell out of my chair. It was so aromatic. But I remember there was no caramel malt character. It was super pale in color. And I remember getting a buzz fairly quickly on it. And I remember asking the bartender, how alcoholic is that beer? Oh, it's a double IPA. It's 9%. Whoa, it doesn't taste that way. And I talked to Tommy about that a couple years later at the Stonewall Festival. If anybody remembers when Stone Brewing built out their production facility in Escondido, they had a private party for anybody who purchased a stone to go in the Stonewall in their bistro there. And I was one of those people, but I saw Tommy there and I said, Tommy, I love it.
You're going to have to go find your stone if I go there again.
I found this certificate recently.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's in a lunchbox at my office. I still have it. But, anyway, I talked to Tommy specifically about that beer. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, oh, that was just 2-row malt and dextrose and these 3 hops. And I'm like, wait a second, you didn't use any caramel malt? Because I had this idea that you had from reading in books that IPAs need to be balanced with caramel malt. And Tommy said, no, there's no caramel malt in that beer. And that completely disabused me to the notion that I had to use caramel malt in my beer. Oh my God, just dry base malt beer focused on the hops. Mind-blowing experience for me. And so that made me realize that you can start doing these really dry, hop-focused IPAs that you don't have to worry about the malt. You let the hops take front and center stage. And Jeff Bagby embraced that too. And they both had some really advanced hopping techniques, especially at the time, including double dry hopping in the bright tank or server tank with hop flowers and pellets. So whenever you got a pint at the bar, it was coming right off of those dry hops, and it was an extra level of expression and depth. And that was something that I borrowed and built on with all of Beachwood's beers. So intensity of flavor, intensity of aroma. Their beers were firmly bitter, but they were not laden with caramel malt character, and they were uniquely dry. So some people have said West Coast IPA is dead. What a bunch of fucking bullshit that is. Okay. So
I know you were just waiting
to say that. I fucking loaded that one in there.
I could tell. You're just yeah, I didn't tee it up for you, but you just went for it.
So people have asked, why do you think IPA is so popular? Well, it's in a lot of ways, it's almost the only style. West Coast IPA is almost the only style that has that intensity of aroma and flavor that's also that drinkable.
Yeah, yeah.
Very few other styles check those same boxes. And so I draw an analogy to like hard rock and heavy metal. Everybody loves a good groove and a chord-driven song. Just let it rip. So
now, this current iteration, like the last few years of West Coast IPA, again, informed by New England style IPA, understanding how to soften bitterness, finding bittering hops that will produce a certain kind of roundness to that bitterness. So, because differing hops provide that different kind of experience. And then, working through that fermentation process to accentuate some of the fruit characters of those hops without it becoming a giant estery, New England style beer. I mean, these are all tighter pieces. Talk to me a little bit about, tweaking each of those elements to kind of find that spot where West Coast IPA is now for you.
For Beachwood, West Coast IPA is not a yeast-driven style. Our house IPA for most of our beers is what is commonly referred to as Cal Ale or Chico Ale. It's basically a Sierra Nevada derivative.
Right.
And it doesn't produce a lot of esters. It produces a very clean, dry fermentation. And so you don't have the yeast interfering in a lot of things. And then as far as hops go, I like lots of flavor intensity, lots of aromatic intensity, and I don't like malt to interfere in that. And so Beachwood's IPAs, at least over the last couple of years, have kind of moved away from like very coarsely bitter and still aromatic and flavorful to moderately bitter, much more flavor-driven, much more aromatic-driven IPAs. I also...
In rough IBU terms, like what would you call that shift? I mean, where were you and where do you tend to land now?
On paper, we were around 100 to 110 IBUs for Amalgamator. Now on paper, Amalgamator is roughly 70 IBUs. And usually in the lab, it tests around 55 to 58 actual like lab tested IBUs.
Right.
But the way I calculate things on paper is a different scale than what they report in the lab. But roughly...
The lab won't really count bittering contribution from dry hopping that's not isomerized, right?
True. And so that's another thing I can speak to in a minute. But I guess I would say from kind of the original Beachwood IPAs of yore to what we have today, almost across the board with West Coast IPA, not double IPA, we've done a 40% reduction in bitterness, in at least calculated IBUs.
Yeah.
And we've shifted those hops towards later additions and dry hopping to enhance flavor and aroma. And, I kind of liken this to when you're eating food and you can't taste as much if you can't smell as much. So aroma and flavor absolutely play together. They're essential together, and they are mutually beneficial and interdependent for sure. So with Beachwood's IPAs, we've shifted a lot of those hop additions from the hot side in the kettle to the dry hop, and that has intensified our aroma, intensified flavor, and made for an even cleaner beer. And there are components in dry hopping that do dissolve into the liquid, they dissolve into the beer, and they absolutely contribute to perceived bitterness.
Sure.
They're not as intense, they're not as soluble, but they absolutely contribute to perceived bitterness. And if you took Amalgamator before it was dry hop, you think, okay, this is a reasonably bitter beer or reasonably hoppy beer. And after you dry hop it, not only is the aroma enhanced and the flavor enhanced, but the hoppiness itself, the lingering bitterness is enhanced because you have additional components that are going into solution from dry hopping, even at colder temperatures.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of kind of rough, breakdown, how much hops of a typical recipe might go in hot side versus cold side?
For something like Amalgamator, roughly a third of the total hops go in on the hot side, and then 2/3 going on the cold side with the dry hop. Some of our newer recipes have kind of shifted a little bit further into that dry hop addition, where maybe a quarter of the total hops go in on the hot side, and then we'll do 3/4 or 75% on the dry hop.
When you, and on your hot side hops are, how's that balance between whether it's first wort hopping or early additions or whirlpool additions? Where do you find that sweet spot for, pushing those hot side additions?
Well, the answer is it depends, and it does depend. It does depend on the beer.
Yeah.
If I'm going to talk about West Coast IPA specifically, exclusive of pale ale and exclusive of double IPA, for certain beers, I like to create a very saturated wall of flavor that hangs out on your palate for an extended period of time. In that case, with Amalgamator and Citraholic, we have 5 hop additions on the hot side.
5 hop additions.
5, which is probably more than most modern brewers. And some of that is a carryover from my homebrew days. But Amalgamator has first wort, it has a bittering addition, it has 2 flavor additions in the middle, and then a moderate whirlpool addition at the end of the boil. And then it has roughly 2 pounds per barrel for the dry hop. Some maybe newer IPAs where we're using newer hop varieties, we might focus less on kettle additions and instead skew those hops more towards the dry hop.
That's interesting. In terms of some of those later hop additions or whirlpooling, are there any specific techniques that you employ in terms of timing, standing, temperature, or whatnot to add a specific character to some of these?
So again, it depends on the beer, but something specifically like Amalgamator harkens more back to those original blueprints from Beachwood, and that first wort hopping, a couple kettle additions, the whirlpool addition does happen more or less at boiling temperature. So we cut the flame, we spin in those hops hot, and it does capture aroma, but it also captures plenty of flavor. Something like a more modern IPA, like Sim Coast to Coast, which is, here's my plug, that's a beer that we're going to be releasing very soon. And much like Hopperbolic, which another plug is we just released over the weekend. Those are beers that we will do less hop additions on the hot side. And then when we send that beer to the whirlpool tank, we will actually add cold water to it to kind of cool everything down.
Right.
And then we add our whirlpool hop addition. And that does a couple things. One, the temperature is colder, so not as much of those aromatic components disappear in the vapor while it's resting. And we also, on the same token, don't capture as much bitterness from those hops. So it ends up being a more aromatic addition. And then we will go a little bit heavier on the dry hop. So that's a beer that presents itself as a little bit more hop flavor and a lot of hop aroma. And for some maybe more seasoned West Coast IPA drinkers, it might not have kind of that lingering bitterness that maybe you're looking for from something like a Pizza Port IPA or a Stone IPA. But for the more modern IPA drinker, it might be a little bit more tempered and more up your alley.
Yeah. There's a beautiful cohesion to these where the hops flavor holds together and there's a nice balance between some of that softer bitterness and that kind of aromatic component. And it feels big without being overwhelming. Are there specific techniques in that dry hopping cold side that you utilize to help maximize that expression without creating a kind of ragged burn to these or dealing with, that's always the thing, achieving this intensity without overdoing it and producing vegetal character, which no one really finds that pleasant, poses a particular challenge. How do you balance through those things?
So some of that is taken care of with the dry hop, but kind of on the more invisible side, a lot of that is carried forward by our water treatment. And with a lot of our West Coast IPAs, they're actually more acidic than people would believe. And so this is something that we kind of borrowed from lager brewing. And acidity tempers bitterness, and alkalinity enhances bitterness. And so a lot of macro lagers, people don't realize how acidic they are. and they finish very clean and very smooth. Well, you can borrow those techniques and certainly adapt them to IPA brewing. So that was one thing that we've done kind of across the board with our IPAs is we push them in the slightly more acidic direction. That doesn't mean they taste tart and tangy, but functionally what it means is that it softens the bitterness, and it also allows those flavors to kind of hang out on your palate a little bit more. And so you taste the hop flavor without it being obscured by too much bitterness. And then in turn, that allows you to also focus on the aroma. And as far as aroma goes, most of our West Coast IPAs are dry hopped at 2 pounds per barrel, which is good amount. It's not extreme by any means. And then we also have the ability to kind of resuspend and recirculate our dry hops within our beer, which is something that we do at all of our facilities a couple days after dry hopping. So we ensure that we get the most aromatic extraction out of our hops.
How do you balance some of that technical performance when you take those IPAs down to a decently low, pH?
Well, I wouldn't want to overstate how much we're acidifying beers.
Okay.
We're just enough to kind of temper things. We're going much heavier on acidification with other styles.
Sure.
But with West Coast IPA, in almost any beer that gets dry hopped, one thing that you see is you see quite a substantial rise in pH. Things get more alkaline after you dry hop them. And so we're trying to kind of combat that up front with the base beer. We're kind of trying to hit a lower pH so that when we dry hop the beer, it doesn't get excessively high, excessively alkaline, and excessively harsh.
Are there specific, you mentioned recirculating, in terms of time and temperature? Where do you find yourself, falling on dry hop for time and temperature?
Probably on the average to maybe slightly warmer side. So our beers are finished fermenting. We make sure they pass what we call a forced diacetyl test, where we'll kind of run it through the rigors and make sure that it's not going to spike any kind of buttery notes, that fermentation is truly complete, and that our yeast that is still small amounts remaining in the beer is still healthy. So beer is done fermenting, it's rested. We will get all the yeast out of there, and we will drop our temperatures to roughly 60 degrees. About 7 degrees colder than our fermentation temperature, which is still fairly warm.
Yeah.
And in general, things are more soluble at warmer temperatures. So we dry hop at 60 degrees. And usually after 48 hours, after all the hops have kind of broken up and fallen through the bulk of the beer, that's when we resuspend them. And qualitatively, we saw a big bump in aroma when we started doing that a couple years ago. And then
resuspend them. So are you doing that with bubbling CO2 or?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. CO2. And we actually have a couple cool sanitary sight glasses that we're able to hook up to the top of our fermenters and visually observe our resuspension and kind of see, that's working. That's doing it.
Yeah.
So we've done that enough times that we've correlated it to kind of pressures and times. And we'll do the resuspension also at 60 degrees, allow a few more days for settling and further aromatic extraction and mixing. And then we will start dumping the hop slurry and cooling the beer down to cellar temperatures, which is basically 32 degrees. And then we will transfer the beer to a bright tank, clarify it, carbonate it, and usually 2 to 3 days later is when we'll package it. But we're doing typically our West Coast IPAs are on dry hops for 7 to 9 days. It depends on the beer. It depends on how much time we happen to have in the tank, but 7 days minimum, usually 9 days maximum.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about hop combos. Certainly earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned that a lot of these were driven by what was available and you started playing with those things. How have you settled on some of these more favorite kind of consistent hop combos, and how do you, as you are evaluating hops each year, especially as there's some range within each of these things, and as you select for the ways that these are going to work together, how do you start to think about how those flavor components in those hops work together, and how do you all as a team kind of communicate that amongst yourselves?
Well, a lot of that is, thinking about hops as spices. You got salt and pepper. You got a whole bunch of other things in between. And some dishes just need a little bit of salt. And sometimes salt can be incredibly complex and enhancing. And for a beer like Amalgamator or Citraholic, which is its counterpart, Amalgamator, the entire dry hop is Mosaic. Mosaic is a very complex, very diverse hop that has an amalgam of flavors and aromas, hence the name.
I see what you did there.
And right, clever. And so Mosaic can stand on its own, but it also plays well with other hops. Other things like Melrose, our original flagship IPA that is driven by Amarillo and Simcoe. That's a beer where I found that I got really cool stone fruit from Amarillo in the expression that I like lots of peach and apricot. And then Simcoe brought some tropical notes and lots of pine. So I found that those two hops and that flavor combination complemented itself. Sometimes you don't just need salt, but you need a little bit of pepper. And sometimes we will do 3 hop, 4 hop, dry hop combos. It depends.
Are there any hops, especially as we see new hops reaching the market, that you've found a particular connection to or been excited creatively by?
Yes, quite a few. Idaho 7 is awesome. I think that parallels a lot of Mosaic. Strata has a very unique identity, and I'm super excited that now that we're getting through COVID, we have a lot of that on our contract for next year. So look for some Beachwood beers with lots of Strata in 2022. I've always been driven to really intense flavors and aromas, for better or for worse. And one of the newer hop varieties that I really like, you have to use it judiciously, but you can abuse it if you want, is Sabro. And that's kind of like Van Halen with Sammy Hagar. You either love it or you hate it. Even though Sammy was a much better singer.
Yeah.
I said it. So I'm going to get some hate mail for that one. Sabro is a hop that I think is incredibly flavorful, intense, very expressive, and is also able to undercut anything else that it's combined with. If Sabro is used in a beer, it's there. And it's made it into the Ales for ALS blend several years in a row. And even at 5%, it's yep, there's Sabro in there, which I love.
How do you use it?
Sabro we have used as an entire dry hop before, as a partial dry hop. We use it in a lot of hazy IPAs as a whirlpool hop because I think it is a fantastic foundational hop for biotransformation if we want to get into another nerdy subject. So Sabro is very high in a compound called geraniol. And a lot of more recent studies have shown that geraniol gets transformed into super fruity esters and components by certain yeast strains. And so it's not uncommon for us to use that in a hazy IPA in the whirlpool to kind of set the foundation to create this really fruity base beer. And then when we layer lots of dry hops on top of it, even if there's no Sabro in the dry hop, you've already set up a base beer that's intensely fruity. So, and that is something that we've even done some laboratory studies on, and we have even experimented with using geraniol terpenes at the very beginning of fermentation instead of hops, and to see, do we get that positive biotransformative effect? And yes, you do. So that's fun. Yeah, it's super fun, and it's better brewing through science.
Talk to me a little bit about using those terpenes. That's kind of fascinating. And for you, I mean, you're loading the geraniol, that kind of component piece in it through whirlpool hopping in order to allow that fermentation to take those compounds and transform them. But how do you define sensorially what that does, and how, what threshold do you need in order to cause a kind of palpable difference there? Something like biotransformation is still going to be an imperfect process, and something it's not just necessarily going to create everything that you want. It also creates other elements along with that. Talk to me about how you find the right amount to kind of spice it to that perfect degree.
Well, I think about some of the, for example, New England IPA, which is really what's kind of driven us to experiment with terpenes and biotransformation, at least on the clean side of beers. I think about some of the better examples that I've had, and they've had that really intense fruity aroma. And how do you get that? Can you get that from yeast alone? Can you get that from hops alone? Do you need it in combination? And trying lots of different brewing techniques and kind of what a lot of maybe originators of the style were claiming was working for them. And then science kind of following that up, and then me following up on the science with that. Oh, okay, so the science is indicating that geraniol or terpenes are likely driving a lot of these fruity aromatics. Okay, what hops have a lot of geraniol? Oh, Sabro has a lot of geraniol. Cool. Well, yields on hazy IPA are shit because the high dry hopping rates, and we don't have a centrifuge. Even if we did, the yields would be shit because of the high dry hopping rate. So, would it be like, is it possible for us to introduce exogenous geraniol, like just by using terpenes? And is that going to get us the same effect? Well, hey, we better dose with geraniol, send that wort sample to a lab, have it analyzed, and then post-fermentation have that analyzed and see what kind of transformation we saw. And lo and behold, we saw, I shouldn't even say lo and behold, because it was, we were fairly certain.
Predicted it, yeah.
We were fairly certain that we were going to see something, and we did. And ultimately, we liked some of the other components that come along with using hop pellets and some of the other things that you get out of the green material. It wasn't purely geraniol. It was too synthesized. It was too clean. It didn't quite work for us. It was missing a little bit of nuance. But what we ended up realizing is that, yes, geraniol is an essential component for how we brew hazy IPA and setting the foundation for that really big fruit bomb.
Yeah. It's funny, as I've talked about it with other brewers in the past, using some of those elements in that fermentation is almost just like using fruit in a fruit beer, that that synthetic or that extract or that terpene alone isn't going to be perceived in the way that humans want to perceive that now. But using it in combination with that real or actual T90 pellets or whole comb flower hops or whatnot, can help put some points on things. And so it's interesting that even this fruit beer thing that everyone has been into for the last number of years, even some of those techniques of blending to build these deeper ideas of what those flavors are come back even to hoppy beers.
And even with some new products right now, especially some that are coming out of New Zealand, like that stuff called Phantasm, which is made, I believe, out of Sauvignon Blanc grape must, if I'm not mistaken.
Out of grape skins, yeah.
Grape skins. So that's an example of getting a biotransformative compound from another source other than traditional beer ingredients, but using it in beer to enhance a character that you're looking for.
Right.
Better brewing through science.
And then if you can use yeast, that helps unlock that even more, especially some of the new yeasts that are popping out to unlock those thiols, then you can go full on. Fascinating to see, how that works even with unlocking the thiols and malts themselves. But that's something we've talked about in other conversations here on the podcast. One thing we haven't talked about in our last hour of talking about IPA is stouts. And that is one of the winningest categories for you, especially dark beers, stouts with coffee in them. And so I'd love to just dive into that subject quickly before we wrap up here. Talk to me. I mean, that's been a formative and foundational thing from early days of Beachwood, building dark beers, stouts, and especially using coffee in those beers. Talk to me about how that has developed and then evolved for you.
Well, it wasn't something that I ever originally sought out to do with Beachwood. It was kind of one of those things that we, after our first year that we were open, somebody said, "Hey, how did you develop your stout program?" And I said, "Stout program? We don't even brew a lot of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, shit. We have brewed a lot of stouts. Okay. Right. Well, I like dark beer for, a variety of reasons, but again, intensity of flavor and aroma. And I think it's a good way to get a lot of intensity and flavor into not just higher alcohol beers, but even lower alcohol beers. And kind of my original relationship with intense flavors and aromas began on a trip to Italy when I was a young teen, and I ordered a double espresso. I wasn't much of a coffee drinker then, but I kind of almost did it because I knew my parents would look askance at me when I did that. And I put down that cup of double espresso, and they were like, wow. They were kind of impressed. But that level of intensity of flavor and aroma and viscosity, that stuck with me. Like, this is intense, but I like this. I'm getting a lot out of this. And so that those same kind of sensibilities and tastes translated to our stouts. But when it comes to coffee beer, first coffee beer that we ever brewed at Beachwood was called Tovarish. It is an imperial espresso coffee stout. And the first batch that we brewed here, our first year in business, I actually hand brewed 3 gallons of espresso at home on my stove into a sanitary food container and added that to the beer. I was like, I'm never fucking doing this again. It took me several days to brew all 3 gallons of espresso.
Yeah.
Fuck that. So the following year, one of our, a mutual friend of me and Gabe came to us with this idea, and he said, hey, I want to do this beer dinner at Beachwood. I've been doing this thing kind of at various restaurants over the years, and it's called Dionysus. And I'd like you guys to brew an Armenian coffee-inspired stout. And at first I thought, well, you're crazy if you're going to suggest anything to me about what I do in my brewery. And then I said, okay, you know what? If we could... I've had Armenian coffee before many times, and it's absolutely delicious and complex. If we can pull this off, it'll be a pretty cool beer. And so that same friend was close to the owner of Portola Coffee, like their first or second year in business. So that same friend hooked us up. And I brought a couple beers into Portola Coffee and met with Jeff Dugan, the owner of Portola Coffee and the original roaster. And he tasted my beers and said, oh, I see what you're doing here. I kind of get this cerebral sense of your dark beers. And I think I know what coffee I could roast that would complement those flavors. And so the first collaboration we did together was System of a Stout, which is a really crazy beer because it's a spice beer, it's a wood-aged beer, and it's a coffee beer. And
you got all the things.
All the things. So it's a big imperial stout that is spiced with cardamom in the kettle, also has a little bit of blackstrap molasses added to it. It's aged on oak chips, like Armenian brandy soaked oak chips, and then it's finally aged on coffee from Portola Coffee Lab, and that came out just beautifully the way that it exceeded our expectations. And then we decided that we wanted to start doing more coffee beers, and Mocha Machine was something that came about after drinking beers like, I'm trying to remember the Ballast Point beer that Victory at Sea. Yeah, that was one of the early ones. And then even before that, Jeff Bagby's Coffee Monster, a very award-winning beer out of Pizza Port Carlsbad. Those were kind of the two that inspired me to create Mocha Machine. And that was one of those beers that really, I think, captured Beachwood's sensibilities with dark beers, but also fully expressed Portola coffee. So you taste that. If you know both products really well, you can taste that like that's a Beachwood beer. But Jeff Dugan, the owner of Portola Coffee, will have that beer and like, oh my God, this coffee is expressing itself exactly how a Portola coffee would express itself if I brewed it. Through our espresso machine, French press, cold drip. And so that was really cool to capture both of those sensibilities and expressions at the same time. And
what is it? I'm curious about that. Like, how would you do that? Like, how would you articulate that coffee expression and the way that particular piece comes through in the beer?
With Mocha Machine specifically, and really all of our coffee beers, I have come to really like natural process coffees, which have a much deeper blueberry blackberry component because of how the mucilage is still on the coffee bean after it's processed. So natural process coffees are much fruitier for me, and that's the expression that I like to capture in our beers. Very fruit driven, like chocolate covered blueberry. And The base beers of all of our coffee beers are designed to kind of make room for that too. You wouldn't want to drink any of these base beers on their own. Coffee's not an additive, it's an ingredient. So it has to play with everything else in equal proportions in the finished product.
That's interesting. So, in kind of practice, what does that mean? What do you tend to bring down in a stout recipe in order to create room for the roast flavors that a coffee is going to bring?
So coffee brings roast, it brings a certain type of acidity, and it brings fruit components. So in something like Mocha Machine in the base beer, not a lot of roasted malt, not a lot of bitterness, because you get roast and bitterness from the coffee. It's a very fruity base beer because we want to enhance that blueberry fruit characteristic. Sure. And then even the cocoa nibs that we use in that are sourced from Ecuador, which to my palate are very fruity cocoa nibs. And so that all kind of plays together, if that makes sense.
Sure. In terms of extraction, I mean, coffee is an expensive ingredient. And, as many brewers as I've talked to, lots of folks have different approaches to this. But certainly there are trends in the way that people have started to like to use coffee. For you, what does that kind of addition process generally look like?
Well,
tell me as much as you can without your sharing.
No, that's fine.
I
I don't mind because people do different things at different breweries. I'm surprised sometimes how many techniques some brewers share over the years, and nobody else ends up using that information. But with Mocha Machine, it's changed over the years, and the way that we've been doing it for the last couple of years is just through the top of the fermenter. So we get coarse ground coffee from Portola, and it's ground not long after it's roasted and rested, and we get all the yeast out of the beer. It's done fermenting, and we will add it to the top of the tank. Usually kind of late in the day or at the end of the day. It's the last thing we do. And usually within 30 to 45 minutes, there's a huge coffee component already in the beer. It goes into there immediately.
Yeah.
And this beer is fully chilled down to usually the low 30s. Coffee goes in at the end of the day. The very next morning, we blow it out the bottom of the tank. So it goes in, it drops out, it's out of there. And the infusion happens really quickly. We used to do it in fine mesh sacks in a bright tank where we would transfer the beer into a bright tank with coffee and cocoa nibs in the fine mesh sack. And then we would transfer it to another bright tank for clarification and carbonation. We've since gotten away from that, not just because it's labor intensive, but because we believe these newer techniques that we're using make a better beer.
Sure. Are there any other, kind of special considerations when you're using a sensitive ingredient like coffee that you want to express, that you want to get the value out of, and you want consumers to connect with as they taste it?
So my motto is treat everything as an ingredient and treat nothing as an additive. You can't simply take an amazing stout and add coffee to it and think that, I've got this perfectly balanced stout, I'm going to add coffee on top of it. Don't add anything on top of anything. Add something with. And even with our barrel-aged beers, there are certain components that are augmented or diminished in order to make room for that barrel character. So treat everything as an ingredient, treat nothing as an additive. That's my advice. It's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to, work in a brewing software as you're trying to create a recipe that a production team can actually replicate. And that software doesn't have adjust for the barrel character or the roast component that coffee might add to that. How do you do that mental math? And kind of as you're writing recipes, think about what that's going to contribute and how that fits in that overall. Some of that is driven by experience. A lot of it is developing those sensibilities when it comes to prediction and correlation. But I would encourage any brewer who's kind of trying to dabble in something like this, whatever stout you have on tap at your pub, and you've brewed and what percentage of roast malt is in there, grab a pint of that and add, like a teaspoon or a tablespoon of coffee grounds to it and let it settle through and see what that does to the flavor and the aroma and the mouthfeel. Like, does that work? oh, it works, but it's too roasty. Oh, okay. Well, I know this stout that I experimented with was 6% roast barley. Maybe if I want to make a coffee beer, it should be 4% roast barley. So I think there are kind of easy ways to get general baselines for stuff like that.
Are there some other malts that you boost up in order to kind of bring forward some of those fruitier flavors and some of the coffee flavor?
Sometimes, but in general, we like in Mocha Machine, we dial up more of the caramel malts. We dial back the roast malts significantly. It's not a very roasty beer. And if you tasted the base beer for that, which we bill as an imperial porter, it really tastes like kind of a fucked up Doppelbock. The base beer. Very few people have actually had that base beer. It doesn't exist on its own.
Sure. How, for example, does the residual, the finishing gravity, change for a beer like that, where coffee is going to be a big piece of that roast component versus a stout that wouldn't use coffee in it?
For something like Mocha Machine, I do want it to have a lot of body and residual sweetness to boost that chocolate, coffee flavor and aroma component. And so that's a beer that usually finishes, for the homebrew world, around 1026 to 1028. So not a low finishing gravity.
No.
But that helps support all those flavors and aromas that are there. For some of our lighter coffee beers, if you will, which would be something like Pablo, which is Colombian coffee nitro porter, which is really more of kind of like a brown ale, the base beer.
Yeah.
That would finish closer to 1016 or 1018, but that's a lighter beer. It's easier drinking.
Sure.
But in general, our coffee beers are fairly hefty. Coffee is not a light duty flavor.
Right.
And so while plenty of people are able to pull off lower alcohol coffee beers well, I like them to be more substantial. That's my personal taste.
Sure. Well, we've done our duty and talked about brewing and your approaches to brewing, but let's zoom out here as we finish and talk about that bigger picture for Beachwood.
Sure.
You guys have been at it for a decade. What's the big picture goal for Beachwood? What does success look like for you all? And when will you know if you've achieved it, or have you achieved it?
One of the things that I never thought about when we opened the brew pub is really where we would end up. I thought we would never can beer. We would never bottle beer. I would be brewing everything with an assistant until the end of time, just to be served over the counter, and maybe a handful of local accounts would get our beer on draft. But as Beachwood has grown out of necessity and organically, I've been able to hire people and experience amazing help. And help equals resources. And so really, as Beachwood continues to grow, as I hope it continues to grow, what's my ultimate goal? To be able to get a company to the size where it can afford as many resources as it wants, where everybody gets to do the things that they're good at, and nobody is overburdened with any tedium. And that's kind of where I ultimately want to get, is where I can focus on the things that I'm super passionate about and really good at, and maybe even get to focus on things that I never had time for before. So that's my ultimate goal with Beachwood, is to grow it to the point of where it has all the resources for all the creative autonomy and efficiency it wants and needs.
Well, that sounds like a nice place to wrap it up. We did not get into the secrets of metal guitar riffs.
Next time, I have no secrets.
So I think,
other than vibrato, that's where it's at.
G&D Chillers knows that good enough just won't cut it. Set your compass by Raw North Star Pills. Try fruit juice concentrates from Old Orchard. The Alchemator from ProBrew simplifies brewing non-alcoholic beer, and make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. Of course, if you would like to support this very podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button. If you're a pro brewer, consider our All Access Pro subscriptions that combine magazines along with exclusive online content, video classes, and all of that fun stuff. That's beerandbrewing.com. Julian, if people want to learn more about Beachwood, where do they find you?
Beachwoodbrewing.com.
Instagrams, Twitters?
Sure. Instagram is Beachwood Brewing. Twitter is also Beachwood Brewing. And we have additional handles with Beachwood Barbecue and then Beachwood Blendery. And so those are fairly easy to find. So,
well, we're going to wrap up here. Going to try to drink a little bit more Amalgamator before we shut this down and I hit the road. But I appreciate you talking to me about brewing. Cheers.
Jamie, it was an honor. Thanks for having me on.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.